The year is 2019. I was a bright-eyed youth going into my second year of college, and a couple high school friends I used to play Magic with moved within walking distance of where I lived. We were all in one place again, but none of us had played much Magic recently. My friends each had a single EDH deck they'd built in high school, and I didn't even have that, having recently lost the mono black removal pile I played with in high school in a move. So, what was the best way to play Magic under these circumstances and on a broke college student budget? Revamp our old decks and or build new ones to match them in power? We pondered this question until noticing a guild die that had come in a D&D dice set my friend Connor had bought. This die spawned an idea. What if, rather than building one or two new decks each, we instead built a low-cost deck for each guild and rolled randomly to figure out what deck we'd play within a given game? This would allow us to play a variety of different decks without straining our meager budgets. Thus began the $25 deck pool. The deck building began in an interesting place. Though I knew the Shieldred deck of my youth had problems, I was still a black player wanting to do black player things, so I opted to build an Orzhov control deck. Putting Kambal in the command zone offered a great way to keep the deck's life total up while chipping away at opposing life totals, and allowed the rest of the deck to focus on removal, draw, and various life gain related combos rather than trying to develop beaters. Likewise, my friend Hans built a pretty brutal Azorius control list with Noyandar in the command zone, and the fact that the pool began with two control decks is a factor that shouldn't be overlooked. As other decks got fleshed out, this influence can be seen. Of the pool's 5 mid-range decks, 3 were some form of aristocrats, and another was a land-focused deck that didn't rely on keeping non-land permanents in play. The pool also ended up containing a few more explosive combo-oriented decks, and these were likewise well situated to handle control, consisting of a graveyard-centric artifacts deck, a big mana deck, and a deck with a number of its own counterspells. Finally, we have what ended up being the hardest color combination to build a $25 deck for, Dimir. For my first attempt, I opted for an artifact tokens list with Rona as the commander, a mid-range deck that could hopefully be flexible enough to survive in a wide range of scenarios. So this was the first pool we had, and we played about 30 games with it before going back to make major changes. So how did these decks pan out? In a word, interestingly. I kept data on all the games, and the Orzhov deck garnered an eye-watering 54% win rate, its potent mixture of life gain, suppressive elements, and explosive combos proving too much for opposing decks. Among the other decks, win rates varied from 30% all the way down to 0%, and as the zero of the group, the Niv-Mizzet combo deck got switched out for an artifact-oriented combo deck that uses its commander, Joyra, to draw into combo pieces. In addition to these wide power differences, a lot of the decks just felt kind of flat and lifeless, generic mid-range decks doing generic mid-range things. For this reason, the Selesnya mid-range deck and the Tatiova lands deck ended up getting swapped out for a Cat's aggro deck and a Vannifar toolbox deck, both decks that would hopefully bring a bit more zing to the pool than their predecessors had. And finally, the Dimir Rona deck unfortunately just did not work, and looking at the old deck list, I can see why. It was an unfocused mishmash of vaguely artifact-oriented stuff, and it mostly ended up feeling toothless above all else. I actually retuned the deck to be a proliferate deck about halfway through this period of 30 games, and that was decidedly not an improvement for it. So, it was at this point where I scrapped the deck, and followed an idea from my friend Connor to rebuild it as a Lazav deck, a sort of graveyard-based combo deck that would use its commander to swing big with Infect through a card called Vector Asp. With that, a commander swap for Azorius, and some tuning to all decks, we were ready to try out another round of games. After playing another 30 games with the updated pool, the changes seemed to be working out pretty well. There was a more even spread among the win rates, and the new combo decks were working out just fine. Lazav was sitting comfortably mid-pack in terms of win rate, its mixture of controlling and combo elements able to pull through wins often enough. Intriguingly, Orzhov won literally none of its 11 games within this period, mostly due to players pressuring it down first in most of its games. However, its place of dominance was taken by a different deck, Cats. Commanding a 42% win rate, the Cats deck ended up being a truly ruthless aggro deck, with the deck's commander-pumped Cats putting on heavy pressure as early as turn 2. The deck was also able to fit in enough draw to grind into the late game, and this 1-2 punch was too much for a lot of the slower decks in the pool. With strong performances from some faster decks, the Golgari and Rakdos Aristocrats decks were deemed a bit too slow and bland, and ended up getting swapped out for two more aggressive dynamic decks, a Griswold Tokens deck and a discard deck with Malfagor as the commander. Additionally, in the wake of cats making a large splash within the pool, several slower decks were modified to have additional life gain, board wipes, and creatures to block with. Within these 10 decks, a meaningful metagame had been developed, a metagame where lacking ways to hold off creature-based aggression was something that would cause a deck to win fewer games. The next period with these 10 decks is interesting because of just how long it lasted with no major alterations to the deck pool. Though this period lasted just under 6 months of real-world time, there happened to be some societal factors that hindered other forms of socialization, so we ended up playing 86 games in that time frame. This fact itself indicates that this pool was actually pretty good, both in terms of deck balance and in terms of how the decks felt. This is also the first time I had a big enough sample size to consider the stats halfway reliable, and balance-wise, the decks ended up grouping into 3 clusters in terms of win rate. The most powerful deck in this period was the Simic Toolbox midrange deck, winning a third of its games, and this is likely because it's just a very well-rounded deck. It was able to keep up a moderately above average win rate after the pool's metagame had been figured out, as opposed to the Orzhov and Selesnya decks, which had each had their moments of extreme dominance before eventually being adapted to by other decks. Speaking of those, the next cluster contained 5 decks that all had a high 20s win percentage: the Orzhov Control deck, the Selesnya Cats deck, the Golgari Griswold deck, the Azorius Control deck, and the Gruul Big Mana deck. The lowest cluster was in the high teens. Decidedly not a terrible win rate, I feel it should be noted, but not a great one either. And this group contained the Boros Eggs deck, the Rakdos Discard deck, and the 2 combo decks. Despite holding up decently in the previous round of games, both combo decks put on a pretty lackluster performance in these 86 games, and I chalk this up to 2 factors. For one, their play patterns got figured out. For the Lazav deck, this meant that people could know roughly how quickly the deck would achieve its combo, and also what weak points should be targeted when in order to disrupt the deck. The other factor is that the pool had become significantly more aggressive as the number of aggro decks increased, and as slower decks added more creatures to stave off pressure. And ultimately, the Lazav deck's biggest weakness is that it simply didn't have the blockers to keep away pressure for long enough to combo. So, what did we decide to do with this pool? Well, I factored in placement in games for purposes of deciding which decks weren't working, and my reasoning for this is that a deck that doesn't win much but is durable enough to stick around a while is more fun than a deck that doesn't win much and also gets knocked out first each round. The Rakdos Discard deck, and to a lesser extent the Boros Eggs deck, was grindy and interactive enough to stay alive, whereas the Dimir and Izzet decks had a tendency to get knocked out first, especially the Lazav deck. So, after 3 different iterations of slower Dimir decks being tried out, the Dimir Lazav deck was replaced with a rogue-based aggro deck, with Sig River Cutthroat as the commander. It had become what it had tried and failed to survive against. With this Sig deck and a new Izzet Spellslinger deck, the pool entered its finished state. We've actually only played about 25 games with the pool since these early 2021 updates, and this is for the simple reason that we each found things to do with our lives aside from sitting inside playing Commander games. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad we did this final update, and the Sig deck I built for it is one that I still occasionally pull out to this day, but most of these decks have probably seen less than 10 games in the past 2 years. The fervor we had for building, tracking, and updating these decks was greatly fueled by the fact that it basically all took place during 2020 and the first half of 2021. And the funny thing is, the fact that I had this major period of EDH deck building during my college years almost certainly contributed to my decision to begin making videos about the format. So, in a sense, Salubrious Snail is brought to you by the COVID-19 pandemic. Garbage sponsor, honestly, would not recommend. So, what is there to take away from this little fable I've weaved for you? Well, to start with, I would say that if you're tempted to make your own pool of decks, do it. It's a super fun process, and the creation of a little metagame within these is neat. In this video, I probably made this process seem highly analytical, but realistically, we mostly just went with what we felt like, with the constraint of 2 rules. Decks should be a consistent power level, and decks should do something unique that other decks need to consider, both during games and during the deck building process. There are a handful of somewhat more generic decks in this pool, such as Simic, Dimir, and Izzet, but the other 7 are extremely evocative and put forth a specific threat that requires consideration. The Rakdos deck tries to render the table hellbent by turn 6. The Gruul deck inevitably explodes out of control if it stays alive long enough. The Azorius deck is a truly oppressive control deck. The Griswold deck injects an aggressive dose of Voltron into the pool, and the Orzhov deck can dominate late games through its mixture of board wipes and life gain based combos. I dug around some old Discord messages while scripting for this video, and the specificity of the decks within this pool can be seen in how me, Hans, and other players would talk about the decks. Can this survive X? Can this pressure Y? Does this fold to Z? If these decks were all generic mid-range decks, this thought process would be wholly unnecessary, but since these decks are so punchy and evocative in what they do, they demand consideration. So I guess what I'm saying here is basically just that if you build a set of decks like this, don't let any of them be overly weak or overly boring, and have the courage to be able to dismantle a deck you like if it ends up being one of these things. As a final point, this process of building decks formulated a lot of my understanding of the Commander format, and when I started building decks outside this pool in the first half of 2023, I had kind of a rude awakening where most of the games I played were way less dynamic and interesting than the games with these $25 decks. My first Magic the Gathering video was partially inspired by this experience of playing against bland, formulaic decks without enough interaction to make for a dynamic game. And while I've had plenty more interesting games since then, I try to keep the mindset that I had when building these $25 decks, which is to say, try to present a specific problem for your opponents and be prepared for if your opponents present a problem for you. To me, multiplayer games are more fun when people have to think about their opponents, rather than when everybody is just racing engines against each other like we're all playing some kind of second-rate Euro game. Thanks for watching. I linked a folder in the description that contains the final versions of all 10 of these decks, though some cards have gone up in price in the past few years, as cards have a tendency to do. I'm also releasing an endnote over on my Patreon where I discuss the Orzhov deck in a bit more detail, so if that interests you, you can head on over there and throw some money at me.